This is the luxury world. Get inspired with us today and tomorrow. Missing the days when John Mayer showed us which 5 antique Rolex watches, including mainstays like the references you can purchase for less than $8,000 today, to mention specifically the models like the GMT Master 1675, Submariner 5513, or Explorer 1016, the staple of vintage Rolex collecting, all for less than $5,000, were the good old days we all wish to come back. Fashion enthusiasts enjoy describing their major purchases as investments, and this includes the collection of different timepieces. A reputable vintage watch can be purchased now, worn frequently for years to come, and sold with little concern about depreciation as there's no considerable damage. You can definitely board the bus with an Explorer on your wrist, but a nice 1016 costs about the same as a used Toyota Corolla today. However, the concept of John Mayer's essay is still true. You don't have to drive a compact car to collect an old Rolex. In fact, if you are fortunate, considering a collection of vintage luxury watches can allow you to make a sizable sum of money in the future. And speaking of good fortune, did you recently purchase a vintage Rolex? Because you are lucky if you did. In today's video brought to you by The Luxury World, we will be talking about if it's worth your time to look at the most affordable vintage Rolex you might go grab a chance to collect in the future. If you still have not subscribed to our channel yet, make sure to do it now so you can stay updated on our future videos. All this probably comes as no surprise if you have been a watch collector or an aspiring one who has been following the second-hand watch market throughout this last several years. There has been a surge in the purchasing and selling of pre-owned timepieces, and the rise is even greater if such watches are classic and vintage. The Rolex Oyster Reference 6426 is the little timepiece that epitomizes the value of vintage Rolex. The Reference 6426 is a vintage Rolex at its most straightforward and budget-friendly. It's the one that comes with a 34mm Oyster case and a silver dial and mechanical winding movement. This actual sports Rolex watch costs between $3,000 and $4,000 when you purchase the typical silver-dialed model. Just like any other watch that is traded in the market, its price will still depend on the quality, whether such a wristband was included in the box, or whether the dealer dressed the watch previously for some lifestyle shots with a cup of coffee to flex the awesome detail of the watch as a rare vintage collection. Unfortunately, it will not be listed in an auction catalog anytime soon, but that's okay. With auction season coming up soon or on the second-hand market, you can certainly look for other timepieces available. We will take a different turn and concentrate on watches with an estimated value in the millions. But for now, we just wanted to pen a brief devotion to the vintage quality and awesome price of the Reference 6426. Moving forward, the manual wind movement is the primary distinction that makes the Reference 6426 to be significantly cheaper than those of other vintage Rolex models, such as the Oyster Perpetual Reference 1002 as well as the Air King Reference 5500. The Oyster case's screw-down crown must be removed practically every morning to wind the movement, usually with the watch that comes with a caliber 1225 with a maximum power reserve of 58 hours in most of the Reference 6426 watches, which is comically antiquated. You can still manage it though, because the owners of classic Daytona chronographs wind them every day as well, so it's a manageable situation. To get a first-hand impression, it's good to see an actual Rolex Oyster Reference 6426. The words Rolex, Oyster, and the precision on the dial are almost as many statements of fact as Rolex's branding. It's all about it being as straightforward a watch as you can get. To simply grasp the idea, the Oyster is attributed to the quality of the watch having the waterproof case, and the precision simply means if you wind it well, it will indicate time accurately, like when Paul Newman commented while giving James Cox his manual wind Daytona. It's a bit hesitant to term it Bauhaus, but that is essentially what we have for this. A Calatrava and a sports Rolex enter a pub, and then the 6426 appears in the picture. It wears slightly thinner on the wrist than a usual automatic vintage Rolex. It just glides on the wrist when worn on a vintage Rolex bracelet. It might appear fragile to someone more accustomed to modern quality, but it has weathered years of use, so it's fine. Some claim that the Oyster case wears a little bigger than you might anticipate given its 42mm lug-to-lug and 19mm lug widths. But then again, for what it's worth, these dimensions are a little larger than the contemporary Oyster Perpetual 34. Even for the best or rarest, reference 6426 is not quite rare enough just to qualify as a collectible or an investment. It's also not uncommon enough for people to have completely forgotten about it. Because, well, folks do not ever forget about Rolex, even the oldest model and collections they had in the history of the luxury watch market. It's simply a fantastic watch for someone who is interested in collecting vintage Rolex watches. Most timepieces only need to be enjoyable and wearable. They do not have to be very unusual or potentially unique. Just a piece of advice that getting started with vintage Rolex does not have to be expensive, frightening, or difficult. Even the relatively simple reference 6426 have nuances and intricacies to nerd out over. A watch made between the late 1950s and the 1970s will experience that. Rolex changed so much during this time, including the lume, bracelet designs, and mechanisms. The dial of the 6426 now has some innovative words, which is the most noticeable change. At 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock on the stock model, it simply says Oyster and Precision, while there are also some vintage copies with Royal at 12 o'clock. It was sort of intriguing that the company with the crown-shaped logo would only refer to one model as Royal, and that model was one of its entry-level models. Naturally, some dials on vintage 6426s have been reproduced. So, while evaluating one, make sure that you compare it to other instances to ensure everything makes sense. The 6426 has several different dial, hand, and marker configurations, especially in the early years of its first production. The fascinating gilded black dials are matched by gold hands, and the watch also has alpha hands on creamy white dials for a somewhat dressier appearance. Although there are still instances with linen, sunburst blue, and too many other dial variations to mention, Rolex seems to standardize around the straightforward silver face and baton hands later in the 6426's production life. It primarily depends on personal preference if a particular variety is rarer or more desired than any other. Many people have become huge fans of late 50s Rolex. Therefore, some of the early white dials with a wonderful warm tarnish are the people's favorites. However, what we have been talking about is the Rolex with a manual wind movement reference 6082, which is a forerunner to reference 6426. A basic reference 6426 with a creamy 369 dial is one of the favorite vintage Rolex watches we have seen in the last couple of years. It appears to be a polar Rolex Commando, a remarkably uncommon manual wind Rolex. The watch was not expensive. It was in fact less expensive than the typical vintage submariner, but it was rarer and more entertaining. It demonstrates how there are odd old Rolexes out there even now just waiting to be discovered and become a favorite pick for many watch collectors. The relatives of reference 6426, which are references 6694 and 6494, have a date window. Apart from that, they resemble the 6426 in almost every manner. They are considered timepieces to be decent stores of value at their best, not as investments. The Rolex Oyster reference 6426 is the ideal method to discover whether vintage Rolex is right for you. You can explore some of the specifics here as well. Do you prefer one of the older models with a wonderful warm patina, or perhaps a more modern model with a tritium lume and a folded bracelet? These particular details can contribute to the allure of vintage Rolex watches. Perhaps you merely care about appearance and want a watch that keeps an enjoyable time. That's acceptable, and once more, demonstrates the versatility of vintage Rolex. All of that is possible with the reference 6426 for a lot less money than the modern Explorers, GMT Masters, and Subs, which are all 5-figure items. What can you say about the most affordable vintage Rolex watches we discussed today? Do you really think it's worth the time and the price? We are excited to hear your thoughts about it. If you liked this video, we will be glad if you let us know that too in the comment section below. Don't forget to follow us too and give us a thumbs up. Once again, this is the luxury world, and we look forward to seeing you again in our next video.